All right, let's just take a look at how Somalia got to where it is today. Look at some of the key timelines in the country. Now, we start with the 1st December of 2020. This is when Somalia missed a deadline to hold its parliamentary elections. Remember, the constitution mandates that parliamentary and presidential elections take place by November 2020 and February 2021. Both of these deadlines were missed. But to 2nd February of 2021, there was the National Consultative Forum called by President Farmajo with federal state leaders to agree on a common electoral calendar. This did not bear fruit. On 5th February of 2021, talks on how to proceed with elections collapsed. Now, 8th February, which was supposed to be the day of the election, this did not happen, as we are aware. On 9th February, we saw Somalia's opposition leaders say they no longer recognize President Farmajo. And on 9th February, that was just Friday, Somali government forces clashed with opposition supporters in Mogadishu. Of course, this is where we are. This is where Somalia currently is at. And we want to have just that conversation. And joining me right now is Dr. Ahmed Hashi, who is a Horn of Africa commentator, joining us from our City Center studio. Thank you very much, sir, for joining us here on Bottomline Africa. Just your comments on what happened on Friday in Mogadishu.
What happened on Friday is the existential problem in Somalia for the last 30 years, where the political class have failed to deliver three things to the Somali nation. Number one is unity, number two is good government, and number three is jobs. The political class in Somalia has yet to find its feet, and each of these political actors in that country have these tendencies that are very, very authoritarian. Everybody wants to be in power, and they want to be in power illegitimately. The great Ethiopian scholar, I think Gebre Selassie, said that Somalia was Africa's problem child. I tend to disagree with that view. I think that Somalia is Africa's child with problems. And it is the responsibility not only of the Somali people, but for the East African community. Remember, we are now virtually men and women in this region have voted with their feet, and everybody's in each of the capitals of this country. And it is really important for the region to pay specific attention to what is happening in Somalia, because without intervention, it might just tip over into violence, because the actors that are in there, the political actors that are in there, are not statesmen, and they're not men of goodwill. They're after the pursuit of power. And it has taken a very long time for the Somali Republic to have a constitution and a set of rules. And these rules have been stomped on by the executive, and the parliament seems to be moribund. It is not standing up for the rights of the Somali people. The opposition called a demonstration which they constitutionally have a right to. And it's very unfortunate that the government sent security forces to shoot at them. And the former prime minister, as many have seen on Twitter, nearly lost his life, as many other Somali men and women who were demonstrating against the end of the term of the current president and the lack of a roadmap towards a new dispensation and a new choice of leader for the Somali people.
All right, you've mentioned that they lack a couple of things: unity, good government, and jobs. So then who is to blame for this impasse, considering what we saw on Friday, clashes alleged from the opposition side and the government side?
Well, the government, the buck stops with the government. The President, Mohamed Abdullahi Farmajo, is the man in charge. He's the man who sent troops to shoot at the demonstrators. He is ultimately responsible for anything that happens there. However, he has also been complaining about the lack of due process with the regions and with the opposition. Let me just enlighten our viewers on one thing, that the stakeholders really are the people in parliament, the government in Somalia, and the regions. And you know, Somalia has adopted a federal system of governance, and the regions have a huge stake in this process. And I think it is really important because we in Kenya have influence with Jubaland, we have influence with Puntland, and I think that the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in this country ought to stand up for those issues and pressure the regions and try and also talk to President Farmajo. You know, President Farmajo and Kenya's relationship is in the pits. Probably not even in speaking terms with President Kenyatta. But I think that President Kenyatta can speak with the Prime Minister of Ethiopia, who has huge leverage. He can also speak to the President of Turkey, who has big leverage over President Farmajo. And I think that if there is some kind of pressure brought upon the government and the regions to come up with a very short roadmap that will have milestones that will bring elections to the the election model that the Somalis have is not based on one man, one vote. It is based on something called 4.5, which is an archaic system that is from the traditional world of the Somali people. It is time the Somalis moved away from this, and they can only move away from this by the elimination of the Al-Shabaab. The government seems to have a huge military presence in Mogadishu. It ought to be fighting Al-Shabaab than using it against demonstrators.
All right, before we even move to the electoral process, let's just talk about the fact that there's pressure from the international community to have talks between the regional state leaders. But then just the other day, we saw the Somalia's foreign ministry accusing external forces for contributing to the problems. So there seems to be a pull of some sort, for lack of a better way of explaining it. So then what does this mean for the country, for the citizens?
Well, I understand the blame game. Politicians tend to blame their problems on others. The Somali political class should get its act together. It should get its act together and form a broad government, find a way to deal with the issues of security, take security back into its own hands, and reinstate the Somali Republic to the Committee of Nations. You know, our government sent troops to the region, to Kismayo, because we were suffering under constant attacks from terrorist forces. So we don't have any terrorism attacks in Nairobi anymore. That's because we have troops in Kismayo. But the most important and fundamental national security issue for the Republic of Kenya is to make sure there's a state in Somalia that it takes over responsibility of its security, and there's a proper government, there's proper elections there. That is in our national security, because we'll be able to trade with Somalia. Cooperation is the way to go, and if Kenya chooses sides in Somalia, it will end up with bloody hands, because a lot of nations who have gone to Somalia and chosen sides instead of trying to bring people together, it has caused a reaction. So that's a proviso that is there. So at the end of the day, President Farmajo has been there for 4 years, maybe 5. He has to take responsibility for his record. If there's nothing that he could have done, he could have just organized an orderly transition and an election in which he was a candidate, so that everybody would know if he still has the will of the congressional, or if I can call it congressional group, because they have a system that is not of direct elections, but one that is selected by clan elders. And so it's like an electoral process that doesn't have the people engaging, but they're representatives. So they want to get over that and get the public to actually vote its will, so we know who is the legitimate leader in Somalia. And I also like to say that Somalia is not only Mogadishu. And I don't think that we in Kenya or government should be super sensitive to being afraid that something really bad is going to happen. I think that the times of going back to civil war in Somalia are over. The only problem that we have is political leaders who are adamant about doing what they want to do without consulting others. And so I think that it's really important that Kenya exerts pressure on both sides, so that they can come to an agreement that is mutually agreeable and in the benefit of the Somali Republic and the region at large.
All right, let's now talk about the opposition that the Somali government has been facing from Jubaland and Puntland. Many critics have come out saying, the opposition has been before the election date and now past the election date. Are we likely to see them go the Somaliland way if this continues?
It is not, Kiambu cannot separate itself from central province and say they're independent just because it's got grudges with the central government. The Somali people are one nation, one people, one faith, one religion. It is a fact, a legal fact, that British Somaliland and Italian Somaliland are the ones that joined to form the union. Somaliland has been claiming that it has reverted back to that. I don't think that that's a way out for them. I think that the Djibouti process in which Somaliland engages with its counterpart in the south is the avenue for reconstructing the Somali state based on the demands of the people rather than the demands of elites. I think that is the process that is going to be legitimate, and that's what the international community is backing. The problem with the problem in the south is that Puntland and Jubaland wield a stick, and that stick is called regionalism. And every time they disagree with the central government, they ratchet it up, put the process in danger, and I think that's a form of political blackmail, and it should not be allowed. I think the central government ought to have authority. It ought to have the rights of a sovereign state. But if we decide in the region that we're going to balkanize Somalia, keep it weak for our own national interests, sooner or later the balkanization will extend to the regional countries, because the same political equations that are in Somalia rearing its head in the region. You could see what's happening in Ethiopia with Tigray. You could see us in Kenya ourselves going to an election with fear because we're afraid of violence. So the most important anecdote, or the most important solution to this issue is to make sure that the process of transparency, the rule of law, and constitutional government is adhered to. And we ought not to be afraid of those things. We ought to move in that direction.
All right, let's talk about the uncertainty, which is ripe for exploitation, from terror groups such as the Al-Shabaab. And as you had mentioned, that this can very well spread to the region. So then what next?
I think that the region should concentrate on fighting Al-Shabaab. It is an existential threat to everyone in this region. But the primary responsibility of fighting Al-Shabaab remains with the government of Somalia and Mr. Farmajo and his government. I saw him bringing out troops to Mogadishu that were highly trained. I could see that they had equipment. And I was just wondering what those troops were doing in Mogadishu, and the Al-Shabaab is around the corner. I think we ought to be very open about this and ask whether the Somali government is doing its part in fighting the Al-Shabaab, or it's just building up its military reserves to maintain power. I think that's a legitimate question. There is another legitimate question on whether or not that the opposition, which is had two presidents who really did not do much about the security issue in Mogadishu for a long time, we don't know what they're going to improve. So probably the Somali people are looking for a new leader to emerge out of the electoral process so that they can now take the baton and move to the next stage of fighting this terrorist organization, because if we don't get rid of that group, we are all at peril. And the Somali government and the Somali political leadership ought to grow up. They ought to be more mature, and they ought to be more focused on fighting that issue rather than bickering over political seats in Mogadishu.
All right, thank you very much, Dr. Ahmed Hashi, Horn of Africa commentator, just for making time to join us here on Bottomline Africa and just giving us your insight on that situation in Somalia that we will continue keeping a close eye on here on KTN News. Well, we'll take a short break. We'll be back with more. I leave you with Destination Africa.